Is there a bright side to temptation and sin? I believe there is. And today on The Truth and Love, we'll talk about that. I hope you'll stay tuned.
There's a message true and glad for the sinful and the sad. Ring it out, ring it out, ring it out, ring it out. It will give them courage new, it will help them to be true. Ring it out, ring it out, ring it out, ring it out.
Ring out
Merrily ring,
the word,
speeding away.
Lord,
Message divine,
and see.
send it today.
Still far from Jesus, many live in
Lost
sin.
and those in doubt, darkness and doubt.
I'd like to thank you for taking time to be with us today on The Truth and Love. We have been for the last few weeks discussing sin. And we've had a lot to say about how terrible sin is. And the Bible does affirm that. We've talked about the definition of sin. We've talked about its consequences, the terrible things that it will do to you, the calamities that it can bring into your life. We have talked about its causes, how it becomes a part of our lives. And we've had a lot of negative things to say about sin, but that's only to be expected because sin is the transgression of God's law. It's a terrible thing. And so to do justice to the topic, you have to bring up those negative aspects of sin. But if we're not careful in dealing with this topic, we might reach a point at which we think, well, I guess there's just no hope. If sin is that bad and every person is guilty of it, then, what is there to live for? Where's our hope? Where's our consolation? Is there any at all? Well, I believe there is hope. And we're going to begin a transition in our series of lessons. We're going to start today by making a transition from the negative side, sin, to the positive side, salvation. And we're going to do that by focusing on a passage from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 10, verse 13. And what Paul had to say there about some positives that come out of temptation, or at least that come out of a study of temptation. And I think this will hopefully bring some hope to your heart. And there are 4 lessons that we want to consider today based on 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13. But let's read the text first, and then we'll begin to look at these lessons. No temptation has overtaken you, except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. In this context, Paul had been talking about the ancient Israelites who had succumbed to temptation during the wilderness wanderings period. And he talked about in the early verses of that chapter how God was displeased with most of them, verse 5, and how their actions serve as examples for us, that we might learn not to do some of the things that they did. For instance, lusting after evil things, 1 Corinthians 10:6, idolatry, verse 7, fornication, verse 8, putting God to the test, verse number 9, grumbling and complaining, verse number 10. And so all of those are sins that they committed that Paul says, look, use them as an example to avoid those sins that they didn't avoid. And then he says, and be careful, because if any man thinks he stand, take heed lest he fall, 1 Corinthians 10:12. And it's on the heels of that he offers this admonition regarding temptation. And his point is basically this: take heed lest you fall, verse 12. But, verse 13, if you do fall, it's not going to be God's fault, because God is going to be working in the process of your life that when you're tempted, He is going to offer you help and assistance to be able to endure the temptation, to bear it, and to avoid sin. And in that we can find hope. And so let's kind of take 1 Corinthians 10:13 and take it in its component parts and see what lessons we can draw that might give us reason to have hope even in the midst of our temptations. And so let's first consider this point as we try to look on the bright side of temptation. First of all, consider this point. Sin, or temptation rather, is common. Sin and temptation is common. He says there is no temptation that has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. Sometimes when we're bombarded with temptations, it's easy for us to think that we are alone in our distress and selfishly conclude and wrongly conclude that we're alone in the whole process, that nobody understands, that there's not a person alive that can really empathize with what I'm going through. And we end up having what has come to be called the Elijah complex, based upon Elijah's disposition in 1 Kings chapter 19, when he was faced with a severe trial. And he said to God, 1 Kings 19 verse 10, I alone am left, and they seek my life as well. Well, God responded to Elijah by saying, Elijah, you're not alone. There are 7,000 in the city who have not bowed the knee to Baal. And so though you think this difficult trial that's come upon you is one that you alone are facing, and that you're all by yourself in this, God says you're not. There are other people too that are hanging in there with you and facing some of the same trials that you're facing. So with that understanding, we need to make the application too that we're not alone, and that's the truth. We have others that we can communicate with who have experienced some of the same trials and temptations that we have, and from them we can draw strength. I want you to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 1. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 verses 3 through 5, where the Apostle Paul writes about our not being alone in the process of our dealing with the difficulties of life. 2 Corinthians 1, beginning in verse 3. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. For as the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so our consolation also abounds through Christ. See, God has set up His religious system, Christianity, the church, in such a way that Christians can find help in their times of trouble and distress by leaning on other Christians who have also been through difficult times and distresses. And He wants us to be that for each other. He said, God comforts you in your difficult times so that when other people have difficult times, you can comfort them with the comfort that you received from God. It's really a wonderful arrangement that God has in place, whereby we can use our personal experiences to help others in similar circumstances. So we're not alone. But even if hypothetically we were to say a person has no human help, there's divine help. Hebrews 4:15 says concerning Jesus, He's not a high priest who cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmity, but can sympathize with our weaknesses. And because He was tempted in all points like as we are, yet He without sin, He's able to help us in those circumstances. Paraphrasing Hebrews 4:18. Or 4:15. Hebrews 2:18 says, in that He has suffered being tempted, He is able to come to the aid of those who are tempted. So even if there would be no human help, there's always divine help. Paul said in 2 Timothy chapter 4, at my first defense, no one stood with me, all forsook me.